In the spring of 1987, a footman at Balmoral Castle noticed something he was not supposed to see. On the Queen's writing desk, beside the daily red boxes and the fountain pen she used for personal correspondence, sat a small, leather-bound notebook. He did not open it. He did not need to. The household already knew it existed. Staff referred to it, in the corridors where uniforms outnumbered suits, as the book. Its contents were simple: names, dates, and brief notations in the Queen's own hand. What those notations recorded was equally simple: who had caused offence, what they had done, and whether they had been forgiven. Most had not. The footman's account, relayed years later to royal biographer Brian Hoey and published in his 2012 work Not in Front of the Corgis, confirmed what decades of courtiers, politicians, and foreign dignitaries had suspected. Elizabeth II did not forget. She chose, with great deliberation, not to. The woman who kept that notebook reigned for 70 years, longer than any other British monarch. From her accession in February 1952 to her death in September 2022, she met every sitting American president except Lyndon Johnson. She oversaw 15 British prime ministers from Winston Churchill to Liz Truss. Her face appeared on the currency of 35 nations, and yet the defining feature of her public life was restraint. She did not give interviews. She did not express political opinions. She did not, in any conventional sense, explain herself. The constitutional role demanded neutrality, and she delivered it with a discipline that bordered on the mechanical. But neutrality is not the same as indifference. Behind the careful blankness, what royal historian Robert Lacey called the professional mask, in his 2020 biography, The Crown, sat a woman of fierce private judgment. She noticed everything. She remembered everything. And she acted on what she remembered, not through public confrontation, but through the quiet architecture of access and exclusion. An invitation withheld, a gaze that lasted 1 second too short, a placement at dinner that told you, without a word being spoken, exactly where you stood. The list was not petty. It was governance by another name, the only tool of enforcement available to a monarch who could not, by constitutional convention, raise her voice. The first anecdote that illuminates this pattern comes from 1966. The Duchess of Windsor, Wallis Simpson, the woman for whom Edward VIII had abdicated 30 years earlier, attended a memorial service for Princess Marina in London. It was one of the rare occasions the Duchess appeared on British soil, and the Queen's household handled it with glacial precision. According to Hugo Vickers, whose 2011 biography, Behind Closed Doors, documented the encounter through court correspondence, the Duchess was seated not among the senior royals, but in a row behind them, separated by 2 empty chairs that served no functional purpose. After the service, the family gathered for refreshments. The Queen entered the room, greeted everyone present by name, and walked past the Duchess without acknowledgement. Not rudely, not theatrically, but with the seamless invisibility of someone who had simply not seen her. A lady-in-waiting recorded that the Duchess stood holding her teacup for 11 minutes before anyone spoke to her. The message required no words. 30 years after the abdication, the offence was still current. The list had no expiry date. The second incident involves Lord Altrincham, later John Grigg, who in 1957 published an article in the National and English Review criticising the Queen's public speaking style. He called her voice a pain in the neck and described her manner as that of a priggish schoolgirl. The article caused a public sensation. Grigg was slapped on the street by a member of the League of Empire Loyalists. But the Queen's response was quieter and longer lasting. According to Kenneth Rose, writing in his posthumously published journals in 2018, Grigg was not invited to any royal event for the next 37 years. When he was finally included on a guest list in 1994, at an event commemorating the 50th anniversary of D-Day, courtiers noted that it was Prince Philip who had insisted, not the Queen. Rose recorded that Elizabeth greeted Grigg cordially at the event, but did not seek him out, did not extend the conversation, and did not invite him again. One article, 4 decades of exclusion. The proportionality tells you something about the system. The third anecdote concerns Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, whose fall from royal favour is well documented, but whose specific experience of the list is less widely known. In August 1992, photographs of Ferguson having her toes sucked by her financial advisor, John Bryan, were published in the Daily Mirror, while the entire royal family was gathered at Balmoral. According to Sarah Bradford's 2012 biography, Queen Elizabeth II, Her Life in Our Times, the Queen summoned Ferguson to the drawing room that morning, said only, "I think we need to talk about what is in the newspapers," and then asked her to leave Balmoral before lunch. But the lasting consequence was not the banishment from Scotland. It was the systematic reduction of access that followed over the next 25 years. Ferguson was excluded from the Queen's Christmas celebration at Sandringham until 2017. She was not invited to the 2011 wedding of Prince William and Catherine Middleton. She later told Oprah Winfrey in a 2011 interview that she would sometimes receive a wave through a window when dropping her daughters at the estate. The toes incident was in 1992. The cold architecture of exclusion operated, by Ferguson's own account, for a quarter of a century. The fourth anecdote takes us to diplomacy. In 1978, the Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu made a state visit to London. According to Robert Hardman's 2018 book, Queen of the World, the Queen found Ceausescu so personally repellent, his secret police had attempted to bug Buckingham Palace in advance of the visit, that she took the extraordinary step of hiding in a garden hedge to avoid an unscheduled encounter. A protection officer confirmed the detail to Hardman. The Queen, dressed in her outdoor clothes, had been walking her corgis in the palace garden when she was informed Ceausescu was heading toward the same path. Rather than meet him socially outside the structured program, where she would have been obliged to be warm, she stepped behind a hedge and waited until he passed. The next day's formal events continued without incident. But the hedge told the truth. After Ceausescu's execution in 1989, the Queen was reported by a courtier to have said simply, "It was only a matter of time." Some entries on the list resolved themselves. The fifth anecdote from this first sequence concerns Margaret Thatcher. The relationship between the Queen and her longest-serving female Prime Minister has been extensively documented, and the list operated here not as exclusion, but as temperature. According to Ben Pimlott's 1996 biography, The Queen, the weekly Tuesday audiences between Elizabeth and Thatcher were conducted with a formality unusual even by palace standards. The Queen did not offer Thatcher a drink before their meetings, a courtesy extended to every other Prime Minister in her reign, including those she personally disliked. Pimlott sourced this from a senior courtier who had served across multiple administrations. When Thatcher fell from power in 1990, the Queen's letter of thanks was, by constitutional convention, private. But its brevity was noted by those who saw it. Where other departing prime ministers received 2 handwritten pages, Thatcher reportedly received 1. The drink never offered, the page never written. These were not oversights. They were the vocabulary of a woman who communicated displeasure in fractions. But the list was not purely punitive, and the second act of this story requires acknowledging the complexity of how Elizabeth deployed memory. Consider the case of Princess Diana. After the separation in 1992, and through the increasingly hostile media war between Diana and Charles, the Queen maintained a private telephone line to her former daughter-in-law. This is documented in Tina Brown's 2007 book, The Diana Chronicles, sourced from a member of Diana's household. The calls were irregular, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly, and they were never disclosed to Prince Charles's office. Diana herself, in the 1995 Panorama interview, spoke of the Queen with genuine warmth, calling her the tops. The list, in Diana's case, seemed to operate in suspension. The offence existed, the Panorama interview itself was a profound breach, but the punishment was deferred, managed, incomplete. When Diana died in August 1997, the Queen's initial silence was read as coldness. But the private telephone line complicates that reading. Elizabeth could hold contradictions on her list simultaneously, disappointment and affection occupying the same entry. The sixth anecdote concerns Prince Andrew and the longer arc of maternal tolerance. In 2001, Andrew's friendship with Jeffrey Epstein was already a matter of concern within the household. According to Nigel Cawthorne's 2020 book, Prince Andrew, Epstein and the Palace, a senior aide raised the association directly with the Queen that year, and she reportedly responded that Andrew was old enough to choose his own friends. The entry on the list, if it existed, was deferred to the category of personal judgment rather than institutional risk. It was not until 2019, after the catastrophic BBC Newsnight interview, that Andrew was stripped of public duties. 18 years between the first warning and the consequence. The list, for her own children, operated on a different timescale. The threshold for action was immeasurably higher. Whether this constituted mercy or institutional failure depends on where you stand, but the mechanism was the same. Memory held, action delayed, consequence delivered when the weight of evidence became impossible to defer. The seventh anecdote involves Tony Blair and the question of informality. Blair arrived at Downing Street in 1997 with a mandate for modernisation, and his early interactions with the Queen were marked by what courtiers privately called excessive familiarity. According to Alistair Campbell's published diaries, the entry dated September 1997, Blair addressed the Queen as Ma'am, with the flat vowel, rather than the traditional short R, a minor pronunciation error that carried enormous weight in palace circles. More significantly, during the Diana crisis, Blair's team briefed the press that the Prime Minister had counselled the Queen on her public response. The verb was noted. Monarchs are not counselled by Prime Ministers. It is constitutionally the other way around. Campbell recorded that subsequent audiences became noticeably cooler for approximately 18 months. Blair was not excluded. A sitting Prime Minister cannot be, but the temperature shifted. Invitations to Balmoral, which had been warmly extended to the Blairs in the first summer, became more formal in their phrasing. By 2000, the frost had lifted, but the list had registered the entry, and Blair, by Campbell's own account, never again used the word counsel in any briefing about the monarchy. The eighth anecdote concerns an act of forgiveness, or something resembling it. In 2005, the Queen attended the wedding of Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles at Windsor Guildhall. This was not inevitable. For more than 30 years, Camilla had been the figure most associated with the breakdown of Charles's marriage to Diana, the woman the public blamed, the name that appeared in transcripts of intercepted phone calls published in 1993. According to Jonathan Dimbleby's biography of Charles and subsequent reporting by Robert Hardman, the Queen resisted acknowledging Camilla formally until 2000, when she attended a 60th birthday party at which Camilla was present. The progression was glacial. 5 more years passed before the wedding. At the reception, the Queen did not attend the civil ceremony itself. She gave a speech comparing Charles to a horse that had finally completed a difficult race. The joke was affectionate, but those present noted that she addressed the speech to Charles, not to the couple. Camilla was included by proximity, not by name. The list had been revised, not erased. Acceptance operated at partial voltage. The 9th anecdote returns to staff. In 2003, the Daily Mirror placed an undercover reporter, Ryan Parry, inside Buckingham Palace as a footman. Over 2 months, Parry documented the Queen's private breakfast arrangements, her morning routines, and the layout of her personal apartments. His stories ran in November 2003. The palace obtained an injunction, but the damage was done. According to Dickie Arbiter, the Queen's former press secretary, writing in his 2014 memoir, On Duty with the Queen, Elizabeth's response was not directed primarily at the newspaper or the reporter. It was directed at the hiring process that had failed to prevent the infiltration. 3 members of the Household Personnel Office were quietly reassigned within 6 months. The reporter was unnamed on the list. He was an outsider, beneath the system's notice. But those who had failed the gate, their names were known. The list punished failure of duty more harshly than external attack. Loyalty was the currency. Betrayal from within was the unforgivable entry. The 10th and final anecdote involves the Countess of Wessex, Sophie, who in 2001 was recorded by an undercover reporter from the News of the World, making disparaging remarks about several political figures, including Tony Blair, whom she called President Blair, and William Hague, whom she described as having something of the night about him. The palace was mortified. According to Ingrid Seward's 2005 book, The Queen and Di, Sophie was summoned to an audience with the Queen that lasted 45 minutes, significantly longer than the standard 10 minutes allocated to informal family matters. What emerged from that meeting, per Seward's sources, was not exile, but a recalibration. Sophie was required to resign from her public relations firm entirely, surrendering her independent professional life. In exchange, she was not publicly rebuked, and her place within the family remained secure. Over the following 2 decades, Sophie became one of the Queen's closest companions, travelling with her, sitting beside her at events, eventually being described in press briefings as like another daughter. The list, in this case, had operated as a transaction. The punishment was specific, proportionate, and bounded. Compliance purchased restoration. It is the clearest evidence that the system was not merely vindictive, it was managerial. What emerges from these documented episodes is not the portrait of a cruel woman. It is something more precise and more interesting, the portrait of a woman who understood that her only real power was the power of personal consequence. Elizabeth II could not pass legislation. She could not fire a prime minister. She could not, in any meaningful legal sense, compel anyone to do anything. What she could do was remember. And in a social world built entirely on access, on invitations, placements, audiences, the warmth or coldness of a greeting, memory was governance. The list was not a ledger of grudges. It was an instrument of institutional discipline, operated by a woman who possessed no other instrument. The constitutional monarch's paradox is total visibility paired with total powerlessness. Elizabeth resolved that paradox by making her attention itself the reward, and its withdrawal the punishment. Everyone who entered her orbit understood the stakes, because everyone who entered her orbit had seen what withdrawal looked like. You did not need to read the notebook, you only needed to watch who was seated where, who was greeted, and who was merely acknowledged, who received the extra minute of eye contact that meant safety, and who received the half-second that meant ice. If this account has changed something about how you understand the monarchy, the mechanics beneath the pageantry, then subscribing to this channel ensures you will see the next one. It costs nothing. The bell icon means the notification arrives when the video goes up, rather than when the algorithm decides you should see it. There are more stories in this vein, figures whose public image and private reality operated at different temperatures entirely, and they are already in production. The notebook at Balmoral, the one the footman saw in 1987, was never published.
No journalist ever photographed its contents. No former employee ever transcribed its entries for a tabloid, though the financial incentive to do so must have been considerable. It remains, like so much of Elizabeth's private life, a documented absence, something known to exist but never fully revealed. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the list. Its power did not depend on anyone reading it. Its power depended on everyone knowing it was there. The Queen did not need to confront. She did not need to raise her voice, or issue ultimatums, or make scenes. She needed only to remember, visibly, consistently, across decades, and to let the consequences of that memory speak in the language of placement and temperature and access. The list was not a weapon. It was a climate, and everyone who entered the room felt the weather change.